There are secrets in the Appalachian Mountains that were never written in any history book. Secrets whispered only in the timberline winds. Secrets buried beneath layers of earth in silence. And tonight I will take you into one of those secrets. A story that most men could not endure, a truth so forbidden that entire families were erased to keep it hidden. The tale begins with three sisters, Essie, Bessie, and Dessie, born not as blessings, but as curses, born not as children, but as vessels for something older and hungrier than the mountains themselves. Imagine their birth a storm raging outside, while the mother Helena screams in a cabin lit by nothing but tallow candles. The midwife whispers prayers, her voice trembling as each child enters the world, not with the cry of innocence, but with a silence so heavy it suffocates the air. No newborn should be this quiet. Yet, these three were, and in that silence, the mountains seemed to listen. That was the first sign that something unnatural had arrived. They were not meant to be separate beings. They were fragments, shards of one consciousness divided into three forms. The people of Brambleholler did not yet know this. They believed they were raising three sisters, but they were raising a curse. And as the years passed, their silence grew heavier, more dreadful. Essie Bessie and Dessie did not play as children should. They watched, they measured, they learned. They did not speak much yet. When they did, their voices carried the weight of authority too old for their age. Villagers began to whisper that the triplets were touched by something darker than God, and the whispers turned to fear. In every corner of the Appalachian hollows, there is a law unspoken. Fear is a seed, and once planted it grows. And with these sisters, the seed of fear was not only planted, it was nurtured. By the time Essie Bessie and Dessie reached their 18th year, the people of Brambleholler had stopped pretending that they were ordinary girls. They did not court. They did not marry. They did not smile. Their beauty was cold and symmetrical, a perfection that felt wrong, like a mask carved too finely. They carried themselves not as daughters of the mountains, but as queens of something invisible. Villagers told stories of animals found bloodless in the snow deer, with their eyes wide open, yet hollow of spirit, livestock wandering into the woods, never to return. The triplets were always near when it happened, always watching from a distance, never touching the kill, but leaving the sense that they commanded it. Rumors spread faster than fire in dry grass, and still no one dared confront them, because when a man looked too long into their eyes, he felt as if he were staring into his own memories, his own sins, his own hidden thoughts laid bare. The preacher Josiah Thornville said their presence was a test of faith, but even he trembled when their gaze fell upon him. Fear began reshaping the community. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers refused to speak of the triplets in daylight, as if words might summon them. At night, people swore they saw three white figures standing at the tree line, silent and still, like carved statues. When the wind howled, it carried whispers of names, names of the dead, names of those soon to be. And yet no one left. Brambleholler because the mountains hold men, the way chains hold prisoners. They believed they could endure. They were wrong, for silence is not emptiness, it is preparation. It is the sound before something begins, and with Essie, Bessie and Dessie, silence was only the opening act. The winter of 1853 pressed down on Brambleholler with a weight heavier than snow and colder than ice. The triplets walked among the people without speaking, but their silence was never empty. It was a silence that listened, a silence that learned. They moved like shadows through gatherings, appearing at weddings, births, and funerals, but never shedding a tear or a smile. The midwife, Marcella Wesley, swore she saw them standing at the foot of every deathbed, their faces calm, as if waiting for something only they could sense. Hunters reported strange tracks in the forest, not of deer, not of bear, but shapes that seemed human, yet split into three directions at once, converging again miles away, as if the ground itself obeyed their design. Old Ruth Bramblecroft, the last of the settlement's true elders, whispered that the girls were not three at all, but one divided, that their mother's womb had been forced open by something the mountains had long kept buried. The townsfolk dismissed her as senile, but they could not dismiss the unease that tightened around them. Each passing night, fires burned lower in hearths, not for lack of wood, but because no one wished to draw attention with light. Children were hushed when they asked questions about the sisters. Their games grew quieter, their laughter thinner, as if they instinctively knew that sound itself had become dangerous. By December, the settlement's dogs had either fled into the forest or gone mad, howling at shadows no man could see. The silence of the triplets began to infect the land itself. Rivers froze deeper, trees shed bark out of season, and the very air seemed to listen. The people of Brambleholler still thought they were enduring. They still thought they were the keepers of their own lives. But what they did not realize was that they were already being harvested, not of flesh, not of blood, but of everything unseen that made them human. By the turn of that December, the unease in Brambleholler had grown into something heavier than fear, though no one dared name it aloud. The church bell that once rang to mark births, deaths, and gatherings now hung mute, its rope frayed from disuse. Josiah Thornville, the preacher, tried to rally his people, but even his sermons seemed hollow words echoing in a hall that no longer belonged to God, but to something older, darker. The triplets sat in the back pew each Sunday, never moving, never blinking, and yet every member of the congregation felt their gaze piercing through flesh to bone. Families began to vanish, not in sudden horror, but in quiet dissolutions. Doors left ajar, food still warm on the table, beds neatly made as though the occupants had been called away by something irresistible. Only their shadows remained burned faintly into the wooden walls, as if the light itself had recorded their departure. Hunters, like Silas Cain, swore they heard voices in the mountains, not the howls of beasts, but layered whispers chanting names in a rhythm older than language. The whispers always ended with silence, and in that silence, a presence pressed down upon the living, like a great unseen weight. The midwife Marcella noticed that infants born during this winter carried strange marks beneath their skin, faint spirals that pulsed when the triplets entered the room. The Cherokee who once walked these ridges had spoken of such signs. They called it the touch of those who feed on the quiet. The settlers dismissed it as folklore, but deep inside they knew Ruth Bramblecroft was right. The triplets were not blessings, they were the door itself, a door that had been forced open in Helena's womb to invite something vast and unspeakable into this world. And now that door was no longer content to remain hidden, it wanted to spread. The snow fell heavier each night, cloaking Brambleholler in a silence so absolute it seemed the world itself had stopped breathing. Beneath that silence the triplets moved without sound, their bare feet leaving no prints in the frost, though their long shadows trailed unnaturally far across the ground as if tethered to another realm. The marked families whispered of dreams too vivid to dismiss, dreams of endless halls lined with mirrors, where their reflections melted into faces, not their own. Essie would appear in those dreams, standing at the end of the hall, her eyes pools of liquid night, and when the dreamer woke, they found bruises on their arms, as though fingers had gripped them in sleep. Silas Cain tried to escape packing his wagon under cover of darkness, but when he crossed the ridge, he found himself back at the village gate, as though the mountain had folded upon itself, locking him inside. Marcella the midwife tested another truth. She placed salt around her doorway, an old Cherokee protection. Yet in the morning, the salt was gone, licked clean by tongues that left no trace, other than the faint taste of iron in the air. The preacher, Josiah Thornville, began to lose his voice, every sermon reduced to whispers, as though something coiled in his throat, stealing his words before they reached the ears of his flock. The church itself grew colder each day, frost creeping across its walls from within, not without Ruth. Bramblecroft alone kept her eyes sharp. She pored over the ancient book her grandmother left behind, a text inked in blood and sealed in leather. It spoke of beings not born but summoned, of lives woven together into vessels strong enough to contain a fractured God. She read the passage again and again, and every time she did, the letters shifted, changing like living things. But the meaning remained unbroken. The triplets were not human. They were a single hunger divided into three, and Brambleholler was its first feast. By the end of November, the children of Brambleholler stopped laughing altogether. Their games in the snow ceased. Their songs vanished from the woods, and even their footsteps grew faint, as though the earth itself refused to echo them. Mary Colebrook noticed her son Thomas sitting still for hours, staring at the frozen creek, his lips moving in silent imitation of words he could not speak. When she shook him, he only blinked slowly and whispered Essie's name, not his mother's. That night she found a thin shadow stretched across his chest, though no lamp, no fire, no moon cast it. The midwife. Marcella began delivering infants with eyes too old for their bodies, newborns who did not cry, but only watched silently as though waiting for instructions from somewhere else. Josiah Thornville begged the families to gather in prayer, but the sound of hymns crumbled in their throats, the words twisting into unfamiliar cadences until the voices that filled the church were not their own. Ruth. Bramblecroft studied her book, more feverishly tracing lines that spoke of vessels marked by silence. She realized the marked families had been chosen not randomly but intentionally, each generation thinned by something no one dared name. The triplets appeared nightly at the edge of the village, silent. Always silent. Their faces pale with a beauty that left men shaking and women weeping. When Silas Kane tried to speak to them, his tongue went numb and his ears rang as though struck by thunder. He understood then that their power was not in their hands, but in their silence. Silence that swallowed voices, drained will and bent memory. Silence that hollowed out a soul, leaving only a shell fit to be filled by something far older than any scripture could name. Brambleholler was no longer waiting for ruin. It was already living inside it. December's first frost came early that year, coating the hollow in a brittle crust that cracked beneath every step. But inside the church, there was no warmth left to fight it. The survivors gathered not for prayer, but for answers. Desperate eyes fixed on Ruth Bramblecroft as she laid the ancient book across the altar. Its leather binding smelled of blood and smoke, its pages filled with drawings that seemed to shift under candlelight. There they saw it clear at last, figures etched centuries ago of 3 women standing together, their faces identical, their eyes empty mirrors. In the margins, written in a trembling hand, were words that none wanted to speak aloud. Vessels born, not of flesh, but of hunger. Vessels of a single mind, split across 3 forms. Essie, Bessie and Dessie had not been born as daughters. They had been summoned as containers. Marcella gasped as memory struck her. She recalled whispers from the Cherokee, who once passed through the mountains, warning of sisters who arrive in 3s, always silent, always hungry, always 18. Josiah Thornville tried to steady the group, his voice breaking as he admitted that faith had no scripture for such things. What they faced was not temptation or sin, but something outside creation, entirely. Silas Kane spread his journals across the pews, his records of vanished towns, each erased after 3 young women appeared without history, without family, without graves. He traced the pattern with his finger across maps worn thin by decades of travel. Each cycle, 18 to 20 years, each cycle leaving only husks and rumors, every warning dismissed as superstition, until it was too late. Mary Colebrook clutched her child's hand, though his skin felt colder than the frost outside. She whispered that they could flee tonight, but Ruth shook her head. The triplets were no longer flesh and bone. They were aspects of a will that stretched beyond the hollow to every place silence could seep into a heart. The book said only this: those who witness must choose to spread the warning or be consumed completely. Neither choice carried salvation, only survival of the story itself. The night grew heavier, as if the mountains themselves had bent forward to listen to the decisions being made in that small church. The survivors could feel it in their bones, a pulsing rhythm that did not match their heartbeats, but instead seemed to echo from deep beneath the earth. Essie, Bessie, and Dessie were no longer girls. They were fragments of something that needed the hollow to breathe, something that fed not just on flesh, but on memory and fear. Ruth Bramblecroft turned another page in the ancient book, revealing sketches of towns abandoned without battle, without famine, without plague. Whole villages left standing, yet emptied of every soul, their stories past, only in whispers and half-remembered songs. Marcella leaned closer. Recognizing symbols older than the settlement itself, marks the Cherokee had left behind to warn future generations. They had not fled because of settlers, but because they knew these triplets had walked the mountains before and would again. Silas Kane slammed his fist against the pew, his journals confirming what the book had foretold. He had seen it with his own eyes. Towns erased without explanation. Each time three sisters appeared as strangers blending in until the harvest began. His maps aligned perfectly with Ruth's inherited pages, showing a route across the Appalachians, a cycle repeating every 2 decades. Josiah Thornville's hands trembled as he tried to lead them in prayer, but the words faltered. Each syllable felt weak in the face of something that existed outside heaven and hell. Mary Colebrook stared through the cracked window, watching shadows crawl across the snow shapes that moved even when no light touched them. Her son's eyes glistened too brightly, as though they reflected a fire. No one else could see, and her heart shattered with the knowledge that he was already marked. The survivors realized then that this was not simply about Brambleholler, it was as about every community, every family, every newborn that might one day carry the seed of summoning. The triplets were not a curse on one hollow, but a pattern stretching across centuries. Ruth's voice broke as she whispered the truth. We are not witnesses, we are carriers. We are meant to spread the fear, and in spreading it, we keep the cycle alive. The candles in the church guttered low shadows stretching long across the warped wooden floor, as if even the light sought escape from what was being spoken. The 5 survivors sat in silence while outside the hollow groaned like a living thing. The triplets had not returned yet, but their presence pressed against every wall, every breath. Ruth Bramblecroft's eyes stayed fixed on the book, though her hands shook so violently she could barely keep the pages steady. The sketches revealed not just warnings, but instructions, fragments of ritual that earlier generations had attempted in desperation, banishments, sacrifices, even the burning of whole families, yet none had stopped the cycle. They had only fed it. Marcella clenched her fists, her midwife's mind struggling to process what the drawing suggested, that some births were not blessings, but doorways, summons for entities that required flesh to anchor themselves into the world. Josiah Thornville's voice cracked as he admitted that his years of preaching had not prepared him for this revelation. The scriptures he had clung to spoke of temptation, devils and angels, but nothing of consciousness that split itself into fragments that wore human faces. Silas Kane spoke next, his words edged with bitterness. Every town that ignored the signs had vanished. Every elder that silenced the warnings condemned their children. I mapped their graves across these mountains, but the graves were never filled with bodies, only stories and ruins. Mary Colebrook turned to the group, her eyes wild with grief. She whispered that the triplets had taken her child already, that his laughter had been stolen and replaced with silence. The others saw it too, the hollowness in the boy's gaze, the reflection of something that was not his own. Ruth finally closed the book, her voice a whisper of iron. She told them that they had 2 paths before them. Silence would end their lives here. Fear would let them walk away carrying the story forward, but with it, the burden of condemning others to face what they had seen. Neither path was mercy, neither offered escape. Outside the wind carried faint laughter, but it was not human. It was layered, fractured, as though 3 voices spoke with one throat, and it seeped into their bones, reminding them that the decision would not save them, only shape the next harvest. Night thickened over the hollow, and the survivors could no longer tell if the dark belonged to the world or to the triplets themselves. Ruth Bramblecroft held the book close as if the cracked leather might shield her from the whispers, threading through the wind. Marcella whispered that she had delivered dozens of children, and never once had she seen eyes like theirs, eyes that seemed to look backward into the soul of whoever dared meet their gaze. Josiah Thornville lifted his lantern higher, but its glow seemed to shrink against the weight of the unseen, pressing closer every moment. He confessed that Scripture felt like ash on his tongue, now every prayer unraveling into silence. Silas Kane pulled a crumpled map from his coat, tracing trembling fingers along the ridgelines. He explained that the hollow was not just cursed, it was marked aligned with other forgotten towns, where disappearances echoed the same pattern. Each collapse had been buried by local legends of wolves, or fires, or storms. But the true cause was always the same: the arrival of children who were not children. Mary Colebrook's grief poured into anger. She demanded to know why their elders had ever allowed such unions, why they ignored bloodlines that carried whispers of the same names: Essie, Bessie Dessie, repeating across generations. Ruth answered that it was not choice but compulsion, for families bound by something older than law to breed their replacements. The triplets were not accidents. They were inevitabilities. Outside, the sound of footsteps scraped across the leaves, but they were too slow, too deliberate, as though the forest itself dragged them forward. The air thickened with a smell like copper and wet stone. Mary swore she heard her son's voice calling from the dark, but the tone was wrong, too flat, too precise. Ruth gripped her arm, holding her back, reminding her that once a voice was stolen, it was never given bay. Cheek Josiah's lantern flickered the flame curling inward, before stretching tall and blue. The shadows of 3 figures rose on the wall, though no bodies cast them. Each survivor felt the truth settle in the marrow of their bones. The triplets were no longer approaching. They were already inside. The cabin walls began to breathe, as though the wood itself had become lungs. Every creak, a gasp, every groan, a heartbeat. Ruth clutched the book tighter, her knuckles white as parchment, whispering that it was not just a diary, but a contract written in blood across generations. Marcella tried to strike the hearth, but the flames refused to catch the wood. Damp, though dry, the air wet. Though choking, Josiah pressed his back against the door, his eyes wild as if he expected the wood to dissolve beneath unseen hands. Silas spread the map on the dirt floor, tracing circles around the hollow, each ring overlapping like ripples across water. He explained that the places where children vanished, where crops rotted overnight, where livestock bled out without wounds, all formed a pattern, a sigil carved into the land by hands that were not mortal. The triplets were not born, but summoned, birthed by the land itself in answer to the sigil. Mary fell to her knees, clawing at the earth below her, as if she might dig to the roots and tear out the evil itself, but what she uncovered instead were bones, not animal, not adult, but infantile, each one etched with small deliberate carvings, words in a language none of them knew. The whispers grew louder, 3 voices in unison, yet each slightly out of time, the effect like metal grinding on stone. Their words seeped into the minds of the survivors, pulling at their fears, their grief, their rage. Ruth cried out, demanding that they cover their ears, but it was useless. The sound was inside, not outside. Josiah dropped the lantern and it shattered, darkness swallowing them whole, save for the faint red glow rising from the carved bones. Silas shouted that they were not fighting children, or even demons, but cycles, each life harvested, each generation repeating the same fate. He begged them to break it, but offered no way how. Marcella screamed. That fire was the only way. Fire cleansed fire, raised. Ruth shook her head, saying that the hollow had already burned once before, and yet the triplets returned stronger, more complete. The 3 shadows on the wall swayed like dancers in rhythm with the survivors' panic. Each shadow smiled, though the faces were empty voids that promised nothing but hunger. The night became a pit with no bottom, every breath stolen by an unseen grip. The survivors pressed together. Their fear, a single trembling body. Ruth whispered that she saw them, 3 girls with braids and pale dresses standing just beyond the red glow, their faces hidden, yet unmistakable. Essie, Bessie, Dessie, their forms stitched together by the dark like puppets on strings. Silas gritted his teeth, declaring that they had to sever the pattern, destroy the sigil, carve out the lines in the land before it was too late. But his words trembled, as though even he did not believe. Marcella staggered to the window and saw the forest swaying, though no wind touched it. Every tree bent inward, as if bowing to the triplets. A congregation of bark and leaf, worshipping a power that fed on blood. Josiah muttered that the town had always known the whispers, the silences. The vanishing children were offerings, disguised as misfortune. He said the triplets were not hated by the town, but protected hidden because they were its guardians, its curse and its crown. Mary clawed at the air, insisting that they could not be seen together, that the triplets only appeared as one. Reflection, three forms bound. Ruth shook her head, saying that unity was the trap that once all three were acknowledged, once all three were named. The sigil closed forever, locking the hollow in eternal hunger. The voices rose now, a chorus of shrieks, laughter and lullabies, twisted together, as though innocence itself had rotted and learned to sing. Silas tore his hands across the dirt, smearing the bones, scattering them. Yet the glow did not fade. Instead, it spread lines of red carving themselves into the soil, the sigil rewriting itself faster than he could break it. Marcella screamed, demanding someone stop them. But who were them? The shadows or the triplets or themselves? For in the darkness, each saw glimpses of the others, faces morphing into Essie Bessie D. Essie Josiah whispered that the hollow was not cursed by the girls. The girls were cursed by the hollow, a vessel shaped from human flesh to house the hunger of the land. Ruth dropped the diary into the glow, the pages igniting without flame, vanishing into smoke that smelled of iron and wet earth. The cabin shook timbers, splintering dust, raining from the ceiling and from the shadows. Came a sound, not laughter, not weeping, but something in between, something older than both. The ground cracked open, as if the earth itself had grown weary of pretending to be whole. From the fissure came a heat that carried no warmth, only the dry rasp of breath, ancient and endless. Silas shouted for everyone to run, but their legs faltered the pull of the hollow, dragging their bodies toward the rift, as though unseen hands had hooked their bones. Mary clutched her son. Thomas, his eyes glowing faintly with the same red that burned in the soil. She begged him to wake, but he only smiled the crooked smile of Essie Bessie Dessie. Ruth struck the dirt with her fists, crying that this was the covenant the village had made long before their time to deliver blood, so the hollow would not swallow the mountains whole. Marcella's voice broke as she cried that the children were never victims, but vessels born to be emptied. Josiah lifted his arms to the ceiling, proclaiming that the covenant was broken, that no God, no scripture, no ritual could claim them now, but the air itself answered his defiance with a thunderclap of silence, so deep it pierced the skull. Every sound died in that silence, the crackle of fire, the beating of hearts, even the screams trapped and frozen in throats. And in that silence, the triplets stepped forth together, their faces pale, their eyes black wells that swallowed all light. Essie extended her hand, palm slick with something dark. Bessie lifted her chin as if daring the world to defy her. Dessie only smiled, and in that smile every secret, every sin, every bargain was laid bare. They were not girls anymore. They were the hollow given shape. They were hunger-wearing lace and braids. They were the debt that had never been paid. The survivors fell to their knees, not in worship, but in collapsed bodies, folding under the weight of something that could not be fought. Silas alone remained upright, trembling but defiant, whispering that he would not yield, not to them, not to the hunger, not to, the hollow. But when he raised his eyes, he saw not three faces, but his own, reflected in theirs, twisted and devoured by the silence that now called him brother. The hollow swallowed sound and replaced it with memory. Each survivor felt their own sins replayed before them, not as fading recollections, but as living visions. Ruth saw the night she left her sister screaming in the woods, too afraid to return. Marcella relived every stillborn child she could not save, each infant, face twisted into the likeness of the triplets. Josiah felt the weight of his pulpit crumbling under him. When he preached faith, he no longer believed. Silas remembered the day he signed his name to deeds that sold out families for profit, the ink glowing like blood across his vision. Mary saw her boy Thomas laughing with her in the fields, only for his face to slide away, revealing the hollow eyes of Essie Bessie and Dessie. The triplets spoke, but not with mouths. Their words rang directly in the skull, like iron chains dragging across stone. They told the survivors that the bargain had been broken, and when bargains break, debts do not vanish, they multiply. Ruth tried to scream back to tell them that it was never their choice that they were children forced into a legacy carved from rot, but the triplets only tilted their heads in unison, their voices overlapping, whispering that choice is the lie. The living tell themselves to survive. Marcella clutched her chest as if her heart were being pulled from inside her. Josiah dropped to the floor gripping his Bible, but the pages curled black as if kissed by fire. Mary pressed her son close, swearing she would not let them take him, but his skin had already gone cold. Silas stood shaking his fist at the shadows, daring them to take him instead. And in that moment, the triplets laughed laughter without air, laughter that belonged not to three girls, but to the hollow itself, a sound like roots tearing free from the soil. The rift widened, and the survivors realized too late that the hollow was not just a place, it was a mouth, and they had already stepped inside its teeth. The hollow's teeth closed not with bone and enamel, but with walls of earth grinding together, as if the mountains themselves wanted to chew. The survivors clung to anything solid, but every root, every stone melted into ash beneath their touch. Ruth screamed for the others to hold to her voice. Yet her words fractured, swallowed before reaching any ear. Marcella staggered forward, clutching her chest, whispering a lullaby that mothers had sung for generations, though the melody warped, twisting into a hymn for the dead. Josiah tried to lift his Bible again, but the cover snapped in half, as if mocking him. Silas fell to his knees, slamming his fists into the ground, demanding that the hollow take him, and no one else but the earth. Only shuddered in hunger, growing stronger with every plea. Mary cried for Thomas, clutching his small frame, but the boy lifted his head, and in his eyes, the triplets glimmered, the three shadows bound together in a single vessel. His lips parted, and the voices of Essie Bessie and Dessie poured out, calling Mary by name, reminding her that her bloodline had once made the covenant willingly. Ruth gasped, swearing it was lies, but deep down she felt the truth crawl through her veins like fire. The air thickened with the stench of rot as phantom figures appeared, townsfolk, long buried, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes hollow, but their faces frozen in grim acceptance. They had been offerings, long before these survivors, walking proof that the hollow's hunger was older than memory. The ground split again, and fireless light rose up, casting the triplets' faces upon every surface, twisted, magnified, infinite. They reached forward, their small pale hands stretching impossibly long, as if to gather all who still dared breathe. Mary kissed Thomas's forehead, whispering forgiveness, though whether for him or herself, she could no longer tell. Silas, still defiant, hurled a stone into the light, but it passed through, leaving ripples as if the world itself were only a reflection. The triplets' laughter rose again, a sound like 100 doors slamming shut at once, sealing fate. The mountain breathed around them, each exhale carrying whispers from centuries long past. Every tree, every boulder seemed alive, responding to the presence of the triplets, who moved with liquid grace over the snowless patches of ground. Marcella fell back against the wall of the ruined cabin, her fingers tracing the carvings that had once warned of this very night. They pulsed under her touch, faintly glowing with an inner rhythm that matched the triplets' breathing. Josiah's voice broke as he prayed, but no syllable left his lips. Only vibrations in the air that the entities consumed with satisfaction. Mary turned toward Silas, whose face was pale, yet resolute. He nodded toward the path of escape, but every step forward bent the world around them, their shadows stretching impossibly long like dark rivers moving without source. The triplets raised their arms and the light condensed into pillars, shooting toward the sky above black clouds forming a dome around the hollow. Ruth could feel her body dissolving into the cold air, as if the mountain had chosen to pull her inside before she even moved. Her vision fractured the triplets' faces, splitting into hundreds of reflections dancing in the periphery of her eyes. Each reflection whispered secrets in languages she did not know yet understood deeply. The hunger, the covenant, the cycles of harvest. Silas grabbed Marcella's arm, pulling her toward the edge of the clearing where a thin path still remained, but the snow and earth shifted underfoot, revealing hollowed shapes of past victims. Their bodies remained etched into the mountain, like memories that could not be erased. The triplets' song rose in intensity, each note a thread connecting every soul in the hollow to their will. Marcella realized then that they weren't just calling spirits, they were rewriting reality, one vibration at a time. The survivors stumbled over each other trying to reach the forest line, but the shadows detached from the triplets first, then from the bodies around them flowing into the night like black smoke seeking new vessels. Every husk the mountain had claimed moaned faintly in unison, forming a low chant that threatened to break minds. Mary held Thomas tight, the boy's small warmth, a fleeting reminder of the humanity that had almost existed. Dawn crept slowly over Brambleholler, casting the ruins in a pale, sickly light. The snow was marbled with dark streaks where the shadows had fed, and the air smelled of iron and old pine. Marcella, Josiah, Mary, Ruth, and Silas stood at the edge of the clearing, the weight of what had occurred pressing down on them, as if the mountain itself sought to suffocate remembrance. No words could convey the enormity of the night, or the silence that now clung to every tree. Every footprint in the snow seemed to tremble with residual life force, the echoes of those who had been consumed, moving underfoot. They could feel the residue of the triplets' power, lingering the rhythm of their song, still vibrating faintly in the bones of the living and the dead. Silas scanned the horizon, his merchant's mind piecing together a route away from the hollow, yet every path seemed twisted. The mountain refused their leaving, as if to test whether knowledge alone could save them. Mary gripped Thomas and whispered promises that felt hollow even to her ears. Each promise was a thread against the tapestry of inevitability that the triplets had woven for decades. Marcella clutched the ancient book against her chest. Tracing the letters, she barely understood the symbols, now seeming alive with the memory of every ritual, every transformation, ever recorded. The survivors understood that they were marked not by physical scars, but by the burden of witnessing a truth too vast to name. The entities that had once worn the faces of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie. Ashbourne were gone, but their presence lingered in the holler, shaping the wind, and the light, bending reality around what remained. The survivors turned slowly away from the clearing, each step feeling heavier, as if dragging the weight of all the lost souls behind them. Their eyes met once in silent agreement, understanding that their mission was now eternal. Carry the warning across too. He mountains to those who would listen, prepare the next generation for what lurked beyond the edges of human understanding. The hollow seemed to sigh behind them, closing slowly but not completely, leaving gaps where faint shadows might still slip through. Ruth opened the book one last time, her fingers brushing over the final illustration, a depiction of the triplets ascending into the void above the mountains. Their forms were fragmented, yet unified, a reminder of what had been contained for 18 years and now released. The group moved forward into the gray morning, carrying not just fear, but the knowledge that vigilance was the only safeguard against the recurring harvest. The survivors moved through the mountains like ghosts, their breaths visible in the cold air, and every crunch of snow beneath their boots, a reminder of what had been lost. The landscape seemed altered even where the triplets had not walked. The trees bore twisted shadows, and the wind carried faint echoes of that impossible song that had bent minds and bodies alike. Silas led the way, consulting his maps and notes, but even the familiar hollows seemed alien, as if the land itself remembered the horrors that had unfolded. They traveled in silence, each person lost in the weight of memories that refused to fade. Marcella kept the ancient book close its pages, a constant reminder of the knowledge they now bore, responsibility for. Teaching midwives and mountain women, the signs to watch for became her silent oath. Every new mother's child she met, she examined, not only with hands, but with vigilance for marks and behaviors that hinted at unnatural influence. Mary Colebrook built networks of watchers through quilting circles and church gatherings, passing coded messages in patterns of thread and hymn. She shared warnings through stories told in plain speech, but carrying layers. Only those who listened carefully could decode. Josiah Thornville traveled the mountain roads preaching caution through allegory and metaphor, his sermons layered with warnings hidden in scripture and parable. His faith had been shattered, yet he found purpose in guiding others to notice and resist. Ruth. Bramblecroft became the archivist of knowledge, copying fragments of the book and distributing them sparingly to trusted families. Each fragment contained symbols and instructions carefully chosen to prepare communities without spreading panic. The 5 survivors learned that vigilance was a living practice. It required constant attention and action, even as the entities adapted. They discovered that fear alone could not stop a harvest. But recognition, preparedness, and timely intervention could thwart it. Communities that listened and acted survived to tell of quiet children who refused to answer questions and adults who stopped asking them. Families fled before the darkness fully arrived, and the entities moved on seeking easier prey. Over the decades, the network of watchers became invisible threads connecting settlements across the mountains. Their work saved countless lives, yet carried an unending burden. Each December, around the anniversary of the Ashbourne Triplets' awakening, a chill reminded the survivors that the entities could return, and that Brambleholler had been only the beginning. The mountains themselves seemed to remember, and whisper lessons in the wind and snow. The legacy of Brambleholler endured as a cautionary tale passed from one generation to the next, a truth too terrible to ignore and too vital to forget. The survivors carried their vigilance like armor and weapon, knowing that the quiet and the shadows were never truly gone. They simply waited for those who failed to watch, to recognize, and to act. And in those moments, the mountains would awaken once more.